Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to the New Books Network. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today my guest is Asaf Elia-Shalev. Asaf is the author of Israel's Black Panthers, the radicals who punctured a nation's founding myth, published by University of California Press in 2024. Israel's Black Panthers tells the story of the young and impoverished Moroccan Israeli Jews who challenged their country's political status quo and rebelled against the ethnic hierarchy of Israeli life in the 1970s. Inspired by the American group of the same name, the Black Panthers mounted protests in a years-long political campaign for the rights of Mizrahim, or Jews of Middle Eastern ancestry. They managed to rattle the country's establishment and change the course of Israel history through the mass mobilizations of the Jewish underclass. Drawing on archival documents and interviews with elderly activists, Israel's Black Panthers captured the movement's history and revealed little-known stories from within the group. Asaf Elia-Shalev explores the parallels between the Israeli and American Black Panthers, offering a unique perspective on the global struggle against racism and oppression. And in 20 short and captivating chapters, Israel Black Panthers provides a textured and novel account of the movement and reflects on the role that Mizrahi Jews played and can play in the future of Israel. But before we delve into all of this, first things first, Asaf, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
So let's start with the usual, I would say. Can you talk about yourself and the origins of the book?
Yeah, gladly. I was a college student at UC Berkeley and enamored with activism and very interested in the local radical history of the Bay Area, where one day I wrote a paper about the American Black Panthers, and I came across a reference to the Israeli Black Panthers, and it said something about how they fought for the rights of Middle Eastern Jews or Mizrahi Jews, and I thought, wait a second, what is that all about? I was aware that my family is Mizrahi from Iraq, and I was aware of that difference because most of the Jews I was surrounded by in the United States growing up were Ashkenazi Jews, but I didn't feel any kind of discrimination really. So I wanted to understand what that was about, and I was very frustrated because I couldn't Google anything. Like, there was almost no information online about the Panthers at the time. This is the internet of 15 years ago. So not like today, also much less disinformation. So maybe it's better on balance, who knows? But I was very frustrated, but I got to asking around and I wanted to talk to as many family members as possible, especially my grandfather and my father, about their experience. I was hoping maybe one of them was a Panther. They could share personal the experiences, but they weren't. And meanwhile, I was becoming a journalist. I still had this. I was still upset I couldn't find any more information, but I had to move on with my life, and I became a journalist. And then I moved to Israel, where I happened to meet Reuven Abergel, one of the founders of the Black Panthers, and at a party, and we got to talking, and very quickly we agreed that we would sit down to do interviews. We didn't know if there would be a book or anything, but he loved the idea of talking to an American, and because I speak fluent Hebrew and fluent English, and he loved the idea that whatever we talked about would appear in English because he doesn't speak the language, and he felt that being in Israel and being trapped in the Hebrew language felt like a cage. So at one point he told me that talking to me felt like smuggling a letter out of jail. And I probably sat with him for 50 hours, recorded interviews, and I still didn't really know what I would do with it. I was very young, right? And maybe 24 or 25. And during that time, I started to fall in love with narrative nonfiction or literary journalism, right? And even though this book comes out through an academic press, I'm a journalist, and I love this genre, and I have this idea that I will write the book about the Black Panthers that no one else had written. Very ambitious, and had no out of my depth with that, but I knew that I needed to do more than just interview one of the founders. I needed to find more people to interview. So I traced every Black Panther I could. tracked them all down, and every person who's connected to the story in some way. And I also went to a lot of archives in Israel and in the United States, actually, and dug up files that no one had ever looked at before, and collected, thousands of news articles from the time about the Panthers, and kind of stitched it all together into a book, the book that's now available for sale.
Now, you just mentioned the term Mizrahi, and I want to ask about this specific terms, because, before we talk about the Black Panthers, I think it's important to explain to the listeners where the terms come from, and also what are the origins of these specific terms and the meanings.
Yeah, so there used to be a geographic distinction between Jews in the East, and then Jews in the West would actually refer to Moroccan Jews, because if you look at the map, Morocco is west of Israel, or west of Palestine. But once Israel's founded, that the distinctions kind of change, and Mizrahi, or Edot Mizrach, the communities of the East, refers to Jews of Middle Eastern descent, everywhere from Morocco to Turkey to Iraq, and even to Iran, which is not an Arab country, and even to Indian Jews, who obviously are not Arab either. Although there are a lot of Baghdadi Jews end up in India, so it's kind of more complicated than that, actually. But and it kind of appears as a term of solidarity, right? So it refers to people who come to Israel and they have darker skin, usually, oftentimes, and have a Middle Eastern culture, and they're kind of treated as second-class citizens in Israel, and they start to build social movements together across these different national identities, and they call themselves Mizrahi, and then the state refers to them in that way. And there's some overlap with the term Sephardic, but not all Mizrahi people are Sephardic, and some Sephardic people are not Mizrahi. So it's not a perfect overlap. And from there, I think it's really, if we're talking about terms, I'd really like to explain the title of the book, Israel's Black Panthers. What do we mean by black, right? Certainly from our 2024 eyes in the United States or wherever you are, the Mizrahi Jews may not look black, right? They're not, but you have to kind of take a time machine and think of how the racial makeup of Israel looked like in 1948 and for the first decade or two in Israel. And at the time, there were the light-skinned Jews, the European Jews, who were Ashkenazi, and the darker-skinned Jews, who are Mizrahi. And Mizrahim referred to themselves as black. We have record of that, very common. And Ashkenazim referred to them as black, and even used the word Shvarze Chaya, which in Yiddish means black animal. So Black Panthers are a reclamation of this derogatory term that was used against Mizrahim. So the Ethiopian Jews didn't arrive until later on. The migrant workers and refugees from sub-Saharan Africa didn't arrive in Israel until later on. So really, that when we say black, that's how they saw themselves.
And I think this is important because there's a general tendency to see Jews in Israel and outside Israel as some sort of a monolithic group, right? Particularly in terms of ethnic identity. But the reality is very different. And perhaps you can explain a little bit more about the role of the Mizrahi Jews in Israeli society and how they came into Israel, particularly after 1948.
In 1948, the country was made up of 600,000 Jews, and most of them overwhelmingly Ashkenazi. And the establishment, the leadership of the country knew they needed more people. But the Holocaust killed 6 million European Jews. The Soviet Union wasn't letting Jews leave. And the relatively wealthy Jews in the United States weren't in a rush to come to Israel. And so they start to bring Mizrahim in large numbers after 48, really in the 50s. And this is soon after the Palestinians were expelled from the land, or not all of them, but nearly 1 million of them. But here a new population arrives, and it looks a lot like the population that had just been expelled, right? The Mizrahim speak Arabic, they are darker skinned, they have Arab culture, and the establishment really didn't like that. They looked down upon these immigrants. Israel's founding father, David Ben-Gurion, referred to them as unclean and unmannered and prone to rape and prone to murder. And you had newspaper exposés about this population before they even arrived, talking about them as dirty Africans. Just terrible racism only a few years after the Holocaust. It was really jarring for me to discover the rhetoric of the time. And when you have a population that is so unsanitary and so dangerous, and you're kind of justified in doing something about that you have to keep them away, that they're a real threat, right? If that's what you believe, then you have to treat people that are dangerous a certain way. And so they arrive, and they arrive thinking that Mizrahim come thinking they're being invited to be partners in the creation of a Jewish state, and they were looking forward to that. But instead, they're marginalized and discriminated against, and they are relegated to the really bad housing, oftentimes languishing in tent encampments for years and years and years. They're given menial labor, where they're cutting down forests or paving roads, and not being allowed to participate in the economic center in Tel Aviv. Their schools they either have no schooling or poor schooling, where they're tracked instead of to academic programs to vocational schools. And there's just wholesale discrimination against Mizrahim. Even where they're settled along the periphery of the country, in the middle of nowhere, where there's no economic opportunity, but also they're subject to violence, because Israel is at war, in a state of war with its enemy, with its neighbors, and Palestinian raiders are coming from across the border and attacking Israeli towns and villages, and those tend to be Mizrahi. So it's not a very pleasant experience, their arrival in Israel.
Before the story of the Black Panthers unfolded, in the general context that you just described, so of discrimination and poverty, I think it's important to mention and discuss briefly the Wadi Salib rebellion, which I believe some sort set the tone for what then unfolded with the Black Panthers. But I think it's also important to mention that there was, and I think it's the only example that we have, a report that was made and written by the state, the famous Etzioni report, that I would say surprisingly and effectively told the stories of these Mizrahi Jews.
Throughout the 1950s, Mizrahi communities are organizing and resisting the discrimination and fighting for better conditions, and that's not a very well documented phenomenon until the book by Brian K. Roby, a professor, I think he's at Michigan right now, came out, and he kind of changed what we know about that period. But in 1959, things explode in Haifa, in the neighborhood called Wadi Salib, where police shoot a Mizrahi man who maybe was disorderly, or he was drunk or something, and there's actually a rumor that they killed him. He ended up not being killed, but he definitely got shot at and hit with bullets. And it's very familiar from the United States, these kind of triggering moments where police brutality just people just have enough of it already, and then they rise up and they kind of, what from the police call it riots, but really they're attacking symbols of power. They attack the police station, they attack the Labor Party headquarters, and this kind of for months spreads from Haifa to other towns and villages all over Israel, including Jerusalem, where the Panthers are small children at the time, and it scares the government. They see a massive civil unrest, and it creates these kind of networks among Mizrahim where people can talk about what's happening, about the injustice and inequality. And Israel becomes so alarmed that they decide to set up a formal national investigative body to look at the causes of this uprising, and try to answer the question of whether there's discrimination in Israel. And they bring there's a lot of testimony, and there's a whole proceedings, and it's actually pretty well documented. And when you read it, it's pretty clear that there's a ton of racism. And we know from historical research, looking back, that there was a lot of deliberate discrimination, because we have meeting minutes where government officials are talking about how the Polish immigrants should get apartments, but the Mizrahi immigrants, they can stay longer in tents. They're used to that kind of thing. But the commission, the Zioni Commission, concludes that yes, there is poverty. Yes, there are socioeconomic gaps, and that Mizrahim are not doing very well. But it wrongly claims that that none of these differences are due to any ill will or active discrimination. That it's not anybody's fault. And what can you conclude from that? That maybe it's the Mizrahim's fault. Maybe they're just not as smart or not as hardworking, or so we need to help them. It was a it was a positive message in that we should help the poor, but we also are going to blame the poor rather than blaming the state for creating the situation, which is very odd, right? Because the prisons in Israel are full of Moroccan Jews by this point, right? Full of Moroccan Jews. Go back to Morocco, there weren't that many Jews in prison in Morocco, right? And the Moroccan Jews who went to France and to Canada became doctors and lawyers and engineers. They didn't become criminals. So something's going on, but even with this commission, the government kind of refused to see the reality.
Let's fast forward and let's start talking about the Black Panthers. Now, the story of the Black Panthers takes place mostly in Jerusalem and specifically in Musrara in the post-1967 period. And this is important because obviously there's a major shift in the demographics, but also the geography of the state of Israel. And so I was wondering if you can tell us a little more about the neighborhood and also the general context of Israel in the late 60s and early 70s. And perhaps you can also include a few words about the Prime Minister, Golda Meir, who eventually became the sort of archenemy of the Black Panther.
The neighborhood of Musrara is located right in the center of Jerusalem, between East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem, right next to the walls of the old city. It's a beautiful neighborhood today, very expensive. And it started out as an expensive neighborhood founded by Palestinian Christians, mostly more than 100 years ago. In 1948, they escaped the war, and then the neighborhood becomes depopulated. And in the war, neither Jordan nor Israel were able to control the city, and so they decided to split it. And Jordanian East Jerusalem, where Palestinians live, and Israeli West Jerusalem, where the Jews live. And there's a no man's land in between. And much of Musrara is in this no man's land. These homes are empty. They don't belong to either country. And into that neighborhood pour in Moroccan Jewish immigrants. They came from Morocco before the big wave of Moroccan Jewry arriving, and these are families that said, no, we're not going to move to tent encampments in the desert. They say no to the government. They refuse to go along with that. They say that we've been praying to Jerusalem our whole lives, and our ancestors have as well. We're going to go to Jerusalem, and the only place where there's housing is in these depopulated neighborhoods in the no man's land, where they move in large numbers to Palestinian homes. And at the time, there's barbed wire everywhere. There is a sniper fire. At any moment, war could break out again, right? Because these are two enemy countries. And they set up their community there. There's sewage running through the street because there's no municipal services there. They're living tent to a room. There's an example of one house or one kind of building where 120 people lived in, and there was one bathroom. Just terrible filth and poverty and crowdedness, and danger from the military, from the Jordanian military. And Musrara is the backwaters of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is like really the backwaters of Israel. It's dangerous. It's not Tel Aviv. It's not where the new energy is. And things going to remain that way with the youth ending up in delinquent institutions, ending up with, they get into theft, or they steal stuff from the no man's land and try to sell it. And at West Jerusalem, they get caught, and they end up in like these street gangs where they don't work, they don't serve in the military. Thousands of young men in Israel are kind of just organized into street gangs, where they're not gangs in the sense that it's not organized crime, but they maybe get into street fights and maybe petty crime. And And then in 1967, everything changes, right? Just like the Berlin Wall fell down, and we have that symbol of the change of the end of communism, and how much and what a momentous point in history. I argue that the fall of the walls separating East and West Jerusalem is a historic occasion as well that needs to be remembered. In Israeli historiography, it's the reunification of the city, but the experience for those residents is that these walls, it's not one wall, it's walls, and barbed wires came down, and now the residents of Musala are in the very center of a very exciting city. Israelis from other parts of the country are pouring in. They want to go to the holy sites that are now accessible for the first time in nearly 20 years. They're coming in. Visitors are coming in from abroad, right? This is the late 60s. So fascinating, dynamic things are happening all over the world and didn't arrive into Israel yet. There was a delay until after 67. And I'm talking about things like rock and roll. I'm talking about radical politics. I'm talking about the hippie movement, the countercultural. All that is coming. So these young men in Musala who are rejects of society, they just partake. They want it all, right? They are so excited. They wear that. They start wearing their hair long. They start copying the aesthetic of that's imported from abroad. They listen to Jimi Hendrix. They get excited about the students who are protesting in Paris and elsewhere. They get excited about the Tupamaros in Uruguay, and of course about the Black Panthers in the United States. And they have a very powerful aesthetic. And they're also learning how to read at this time. There's a group of pioneering social workers who are Mizrahi, who kind of moved from a model of helping the poor by just handing out aid to the poor, to organizing the poor so they can demand change, systemic change. And so they adopt these young men in Musala, and they teach them how to read, and they do that by teaching them to read the newspaper. And so these young men are reading about one of the big topic was the American Black Panthers, and newspapers refer to them as anti-Semitic and talk about how they're very scary and very dangerous because they supported the Palestinian cause. And then the takeaway from these young men is that the government is very scared of whoever these Black Panthers are. Maybe we should be like them and fight for change. And that is how those ideas start trickling in. Of course, it's very interesting that just so happens to be that the Prime Minister of Israel at the time is Golda Meir, who was raised in the United States and is very aware of the explosive racial dynamics in the United States, and aware of of the racism of the place. And you have to remember, she considers herself not racist at all. So she considers herself a socialist, aligned with the global left in all these ways. And she also was around in 1959 when Wadi Salib erupted in Haifa, and she and her deputies, her fellow government ministers, are very aware of the explosiveness that can come from Mizrahi Ashkenazi issues. Right back then, they had clashes with police and attacks on police stations and on party headquarters, and so she's just the perfect foil for these young men.
And I want to talk about these young men, and obviously it's impossible to talk about all of them. Also, we want to leave the readers the possibility to get acquainted with them. But I was wondering if you can at least introduce some of the most important characters, at least to me, fascinating individuals. Reuven Abergel, Saadia Marciano, and also Avraham Bardugo, were in different ways the founders and the leaders of the Black Panthers.
Yeah, let's start with Saadia Marciano. I never got to meet him. He died a decade before I started the book. He died young, but he was this. I explained that there are street gangs. He was the leader of his street gang. He had the charisma. We're all, a group of 15 other guys kind of listened to him, did what he said, looked up to him, and he was just pure sex appeal, right? Like, he had beautiful mane of hair, this wide jaw, these piercing eyes. The photos of him, you have to look him up. He was just the photographers of the day were obsessed with him. So were the visitors who were coming from abroad, right? Part of the what the Panthers are doing, or these young men are doing with all the visitors. They're having sex with these foreign women, and it's like very exciting for both sides. Grew up very, very poor. I think he had 13 siblings, and he becomes very, very, very angry when he realizes that his up life, that what's happening to him is not just about him, it's about his whole community. He's very angry that he's excluded from contributing to the war as a soldier. He's just angry. He's angry. He's seeing Jews arrive from the Soviet Union for the first time, and in the early 70s, and they're getting all kinds of government benefits. And he's like, wait a second, what about, we've been in line for 20 years. How come we didn't get anything? Why are they getting apartments? Why are they getting he says, like, we should do something about this. And he's always very intuitively smart. He can recognize he always sides with the underdog. He always can recognize that that race, he's against racism when it's applied to his community, but also when it's applied to Palestinians. He's very astute in that way. And what else can I tell you about him? Just a natural leader, kind of, is the early founder of the Panthers. Then Avi Berdugo is this other character who's a little bit older. He has more education. He's also a Moroccan Jew, just like Saadia, but he is very light-skinned, and he can totally pass for Ashkenazi, and he has these like Lenin-style round glasses and long hair, and looks like a hippie. He looks like he came out of Woodstock or out of Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. He was able to copy the style so precisely. And he had just gone through a transformation. He'd been calling himself Avi Akarmeli, which sounds like a tzabar name, sounds like another Ashkenazi who was born in Israel. And he kind of let people believe that he was Ashkenazi or born in Israel, not Moroccan. And then he switches around this time. He decides to go back to Berdugo, confuses a few people, and he's also, he's reading these magazines that are coming from abroad. He's aware of what's happening in Oakland and in New York, in Harlem, and in the streets of Paris and elsewhere. And he is doing so many things at once. He's kind of running nightclubs. He becomes a law student at the same time, and he's also like a major hashish dealer. He's not like a drug trafficker. He supplies hashish to the Bohemian set in Jerusalem of those days, right? Because he's got these nightclubs and these cafes. One of them is called the Yellow Tea House. And he knows he knows where to get hashish, and he doesn't even really get it from the source, because him and the Bohemians are a little scared of East Jerusalem, a little scared of Palestinians. So the Mizrahim and Musrara, they're not. They immediately make friends with Palestinians in East Jerusalem, and they become the middlemen to the hashish dealers to the hashish consumers in West Jerusalem. And Berdugo, one day, his regular hashish dealer, he can't find him, so he just heads down to Musala. He knows someone will have a connect, and he stumbles upon this group of young people, a street gang led by Marciano is right there. He doesn't know him yet. Marciano, Cocoderi, Charlie Beaton, these other guys, and he gets to talking, and they start smoking together. And before they do any deal, he hangs out with them. He goes up to the roof of Cocoderi's house, in his apartment building. There's this little roof where they hang out, and he hears them talk about how they're like getting political. And he's like, you guys are a lot like the Black Panthers. And he starts to like kind of tell them about what he knows and introduce them to his world. And for him, this is so cool. This is a real authentic kind of energy from below, this grassroots agitation. And he invites him to come to the Yellow Tea House, where they meet some more radicals from abroad and from Israel. And these kind of conversations are ongoing, where they're getting a political education, but they're also friends. And then that, again, helps build up this momentum towards a movement. Reuven Abergel is not part of this set. He's older. He has a child. He's married. his brothers are friends with Sadia Marziano, but he is not yet in that group. He is more further along in the career path that's available to Mizrahim and Musar at the time. He's more of a thug. He is he maybe runs little gambling games on the side. He's more doing the actual hashish dealing. So he's like this tough guy, this someone that the younger guys can aspire to be like, even though it's like what he is nothing. He's just like like the neighborhood thug. And it could have gone on that way, right? Like he Rovena Bergel has these like natural intellectual abilities, even though he didn't finish even second. He finished like second or third grade in school and then dropped out. Could have gone. Well, we don't have to get into his whole history, but he doesn't get into the army. There's a lot of colorful stories leading up to the Panthers that I don't. You should read about him, but his involvement in this story comes on the very first protest of the Panthers. So should I get into what happens?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, if you can speak about how the movement emerged, developed, and also how they got to be known as the Black Panthers. So there's also a process in selecting the name. So I was wondering if you can speak a little bit about this process, and particularly how they became politicized, so perhaps their relationship with the left, and also with local authorities, because obviously they are known as thug, as you mentioned, and so they're already known to the police, but later on they also become politically active. So, this I think is an important element for the listeners to get.
Yeah, so let me do this build up. So they're talking about being like the Panthers. Then one of the social workers like leaks that to the media, and then the press wants to know everything they can. There's all these articles, and they interview who they can, and they make a big deal about it. And then they are getting closer to these young people who are kind of affiliated with Matzpen, the anti-Zionist group, but not quite part of Matzpen, even though Matzpen does later on become involved. It's complicated leftist history. It doesn't really matter. And they decide they're going to have their very first protest, and they print out flyers that say, enough with the poverty, enough with the discrimination, enough with the police beating, enough with this and that. And the police kind of freak out, and they say, we can't let this happen. So they take it to their superiors, and they take it to the minister of police, and he's like, I don't know what to do. I'm going to tell the prime minister. And she calls an emergency meeting, right? This group of hooligans say they're going to have a protest, and now the prime minister is having an emergency meeting with her top advisors. Very odd. But it's, they were, she was scared. She was scared, and they have a debate about what to do. And we have kind of documentation of this meeting in the archives. And she comes to the decision that the police should arrest all of them and prevent them from protesting. And of course, that teaches the Panthers that that's exactly the right name that they picked, because they've managed to scare the prime minister so much. And what is like the thought police? Like, we haven't done a crime and we're already getting arrested. The police actually had to invoke British mandate era laws to justify the arrest using kind of emergency decrees. And today we call it administrative detention, when they hold you indefinitely without a charge, really. So it's very controversial, but commonly used today. But that's kind of when they started to use it, at least on Jews. And so let's see, where were we? I got ahead of myself, but everyone kind of asked the Panthers before, during, after, why did you choose this name, the Black Panthers? And they're anti-Semitic or whatever, and they don't allow themselves to be cowed by that. And they say, no, wait a second, look at your reaction. Pay attention to your own reaction to that name. We got your attention. When our parents' generation called themselves the Association of Immigrants from Morocco, did you listen to them? You didn't. There was no exposés in the newspaper. The prime minister didn't get involved. So we were pretty sure we picked the right name. Thank you very much. And so there's the first protest, right? So the police spent all day rounding up the Panthers, raiding the cafes, raiding their homes, putting them in lockup, and of course, that backfires, because anyone who has a sense of right and wrong is against these police raids. and everyone shows up to this protest, and a lot of people who aren't even from the neighborhood, all the like liberals from Tel Aviv show up, and the Bohemians and all the famous cultural icons, and of course they give speeches, but they need real authentic voices from the neighborhood. They're aware that they can't just have a bunch of Ashkenazim talk at this thing, and one of the voices that emerged, that kind of who comes out of the crowd, is Reuven Abergel, who is older, but he is in shock with what he sees, right? He is seeing police behaving very courteously to him, keeping their hands off him, keeping their distance. They're not being, he's used to being manhandled by police and being spoken to rudely. And he's amazed by all these people who show up to support his community. It's like, oh, I didn't know people would care that we're living the way we're living. And to him, that is described as kind of his moment of seeing God, his burning bush moment. And he doesn't even really remember today what he said, but he spoke to the crowd, and then he became kind of the next, alongside Sadia Marziano, the next leader of the group. And Reuven Abergel is important because he's kind of the last of the leaders to still be alive today. He was my entry point into. He's the one I interviewed to begin with. He's my entry point to the story. And I'm very close to him to this day. And he has spent decades in activism and social justice organizing with every community, not just Mizrahim. And he comes up and that's when the movement launches in earnest, once they realize that they really scared the establishment.
So let me ask about the police again, because the movement was gaining momentum. There's also support from Ashkenazi Jews. But obviously the police were scared, and as you mentioned, they didn't know exactly what to do, but they eventually were able to place a spy within the leadership, which is known as P51.
Yeah, so we actually know that already. One of the things they do after Wadi Salib in 1959, right, 12 years earlier, was set up a spy network. They create two undercover operations to infiltrate Mizrahi communities, just like we've heard about COINTELPRO in the United States. So the Jewish state was created an ethnic-based spying program on Jews, and we don't know how long that those operations lasted, but we know that the police had in place capacity to spy on its own citizens who are not criminals or anything, just political organizers and political agitators, and so they start to work on their informants, and then they recruit this guy. Should I spoil what this guy's story is? I mean, he's a pimp. He's like a pimp in Jerusalem, right? He traffics in women, or he at least is. He has prostitutes under him, and he's known to police, and they strike a deal with him, like, we'll let you keep operating, we'll look the other way, but you need to infiltrate the Panthers. And he's older, he has money. And the Panthers are like kind of desperate for help, and he's kind of charismatic, and they let him into the movement, and he reports back like almost on a daily basis in those first months and the first year to his handlers and the police, at one point they even they have a vote for their new leader, and he wins the vote because he's become so popular. But he's, for whatever reason, maybe to win credibility later on or to win confidence, or we don't really know, he kind of decides, no, I can't be the leader. We have to do this again. But, he's also, so he's their source. And I owe him a big debt of gratitude, because some of the best documentation we have of the day-to-day meetings of why I'm able to create suspense and create a story is because we have his notes, his extensive notes.
Yeah, from an historical perspective, it's certainly fascinating, particularly the kind of details he provided. And I was curious after reading about him, and I tried to get a few documents. Like, wow, I mean, he was also able to provide a lot of details. However, the same details didn't prevent eventually the Black Panthers to stage what then came to be known as the Night of the Panthers in 1971, around the time of Pesach, a Jewish Passover.
Yeah, soon after Passover, they're gearing up for a big protest, and thousands and thousands of Israelis at a time when the country has a much smaller population than today, right? A very small country. Jerusalem, I think, maybe has 100,000 people in West Jerusalem at the time. And they go into the streets and they march along the main street, Jaffa Road, and kind of hold rallies in the main plaza and then the next main plaza. And the police come in and say, your permit says you can do this, it says you can't do this, and they start to fight with the protesters, and it turns into the massive street brawl where protesters are throwing rock, and the police are beating people with batons, and they take their water cannon, they start spraying people, and they actually end up hitting a baby at one point, and even hitting other cops, and it just becomes a wild scene where shop windows are breaking, and the police arrest tons of people, and they in lockup already. They beat them up, and we actually I was able to find hospital records of their injuries. So it was very bad: stitches, broken bones, broken ribs, blood everywhere, and that becomes known as the Night of the Panthers. The night ends after nearly all the Panthers are already locked up. Ends with 3 Molotov cocktails being thrown. And that's not something that had happened before, right? Israel was not a country where Molotov cocktails were thrown very often. And it's that earns the movement a reputation for being violent, even though, there's a lot of context to that, but we don't actually know who threw the Molotov cocktails. It's very possible that it wasn't the Panthers, or that it was someone marginal to the group, or that it was the very informant that the police. I heard from at least one person that it was P51 who threw the Molotov cocktails. I later found that he was a pyromaniac, according to his own brother, who wrote about this in totally different context. But from a very young age, P51 was obsessed with lighting things on fire. So we don't really know. But Golda Meir makes a big deal of it. The next day, she's on national TV, and she says, "How could a Jew raise their hand against another Jew?" And she wasn't referring to the police beating up peaceful protesters. She was referring to the Molotov cocktail. And she says, "I met with these guys." She did a month earlier. She met with them in a famous meeting, and she says they're not nice boys. I met them, that becomes a very condescending slogan, not nice. That subsequent generations of Mizrahi activists take on that as their slogan, and even there's a group that comes to be called the not nice. So just very dramatic. Unfortunately, the TV station was on strike that day, so we don't have any video of that protest.
So the not so nice boys eventually were impossible to ignore by 1971. And I was wondering if you can speak a little bit about the perceptions, both domestically and internationally, of the Black Panthers.
Yeah, they become impossible to ignore. The newspaper headlines are dominated by coverage of the Panthers. Everything they do gets covered in all the papers, including the foreign press. New York Times does a cover story on New York Times Magazine does a cover story on the Panthers. Washington Post, LA Times, Baltimore Sun, all of them. Le Monde in France, German papers, British papers, everyone. What happens was there was the issue of inequality and poverty and the massive discrimination and racism faced by Mizrahim just wasn't talked about in a public way at all. And now it's blown wide open. And that is, domestic issues come to the very forefront of Israel. This is a big problem in terms of Israel's foreign image, because Israel's trying to encourage immigration from the United States, or donations to Israel from the United States, from the Jewish communities. Well, why should people donate to a country that says it's a Jewish state, but is discriminating against Jews based on their skin color? So it's not a very good look for Israel. And the Panthers are seen as by Mizrahim and by everyone really as an authentic expression of a grievance and of an injustice. Now, some people accuse the Panthers of taking things too far, of adopting the wrong name, of being too militant, of using they didn't like the imported rhetoric. They used to say things like by any means necessary, or they would threaten to overthrow the state. And Israel is very focused on like solidarity and cohesion, and we have to be united against our enemies. So it's very controversial to like raise divisive issues. Even though, right, the discrimination is what caused the division to begin with, but it's often blamed on the people who point out the injustice.
Yeah, because what I found interesting from an historical perspective is that their season has been rather short. I mean, the momentum was lost rather quickly after 71, and yet you point out in the book, historians that work on that, Israel underwent a series of social and economic reforms, which eventually can be traced back to the original demands of the Black Panthers. So one wonders, is that their legacy?
It's part of their legacy, a big part of it, right? In 1972 is the very first time in Israeli history that the government allocated more of its budget to social welfare needs than to the military. And that's why people have called it the budget of the Panthers. And there were reforms in the criminal justice system to make it so that youth are treated much better and differently instead of being treated as adults. The military changes how it enlists people. It stops like automatically canceling anyone who had any kind of criminal record. Let's say they stole a fruit in the past, and now they're not barred from serving anymore. So massive changes. Israel at the time didn't have universal health care, had very poor social security or national insurance system. And it starts as a direct result of the Panthers, it starts to enact policies modeled after the social democracies of Europe, of Scandinavia, of France, of the UK ends up going through a certain change. I don't know if it's a good comparison with Thatcher and everything, but so all the kind of robust welfare policies that Israel has had are a result of this period. The Likud, which takes over, gets rid of some things, not everything. So it is one of the legacies. The other part of their legacy is just the flourishing in arts and culture for Mizrahim. We have a massive creativity following the Panthers, where people are inspired to like explore their roots, or inspired to write and make music about the conditions that they face. So very important novelists and musicians and fine artists kind of come up during this period. That's a big part of it. And the other legacy is just the kind of the mental freedom that the Panthers gave to the Mizrahi public. They'd come to Israel. They wanted to fall into line, do what was expected. They voted for the Labor Party. They wanted to contribute, and they didn't necessarily always feel like they were allowed to rebel. And the Panthers told them, like, who are you being loyal to? This party, the Labor Party, that's like screwed you over? Like, you don't need to be loyal to them. And that had a transformative effect on Israeli politics that is still felt to this day.
And I really am curious about politics, because in the long run, Mizrahi Jews shifted their political allegiance from the left to the right, to either the Likud, Shah, and obviously other religious parties nowadays. So can you explain a little bit more of these dynamics? I mean, can you elaborate perhaps more on the possibility that never materialized, for instance, that the Panthers, Mizrahi Jews at large, could have served as a bridge between Israelis, so Jews, and Palestinians, for instance?
Yeah, I want to tackle those two issues separately: the Mizrahim and the right, and Mizrahim and the Panthers and the Palestinian issue. Let's start with Panthers and the Palestinian issue, because it will help make it more dramatic what we see later on. Because the Panthers were a left-wing movement, right? They started out focusing on socioeconomic issues, but very quickly they also kind of give themselves permission to opine on the Palestinian issue. And they're among the very first Israelis to call for the recognition of a Palestinian state at a time when Israelis in general considered anything Palestinian to just be illegitimate and terrorist. The first Israelis to meet with Yasser Arafat and to recognize him as the leader of the Palestinian movement were Black Panthers. They are really ahead of the Israeli society. The Mizrahim did not follow the Panthers to the left, right? And they, in general, moved to the right. Now, it's important to remember that people of all backgrounds in Israel used to vote for the left-wing Zionist party, the Labor Party, and parties to the left of it. The left dominated Israeli politics for decades, and so the whole country has moved right. Mizrahim are often very visible in that, but they're not they haven't moved more to the right than other groups necessarily. There's a lot of other constituents that not even necessarily ones that are ethnic. We have to put that in the context of a country that's moved right. But it's very interesting today. You'll have members of Likud, of the right-wing party, who are nostalgic about Black Panthers. That's odd, right? You'd never see Republicans in the United States being nostalgic about Hugh Newton, Bobby Seale, and the Black Panther Party. That's because of what exactly happened. The Panthers in Israel and the Mizrahim in general, they ultimately wanted to belong. The Panthers in the States, they wanted to overthrow capitalism and overthrow imperialism, and they were very hardcore Marxists and very ideological. And they said, white America doesn't want us. We don't need it. We're gonna overthrow it all and build our own stuff. The Panthers in Israel talked about big game about being radical, but they ultimately really wanted to belong. Mizrahim were kind of confused and angry that Ashkenazim treated them the way they did, but they didn't give up on the hope of belonging. And the person was able to capitalize on that once the grievance was aired, once the loyalty to the Labor Party was broken. The person who was able to capitalize on that energy was Menachem Begin, the founder of the Likud party, predecessor to Benjamin Netanyahu. And he said, Mizrahim, you belong center stage. You belong in the middle. You belong with me. You're the real warriors. You're the real Jews. Enough with the past. We are going to put you in the center. And that is very compelling to Mizrahim. And for a few reasons. One of them is they have good reasons to be more militant or more nationalistic. Some of them are kind of sad reasons. One, they suffered more from Arab violence when there was war. Later on, during the Second Intifada, when buses are blowing up, like who takes the bus? More likely, Mizrahim are taking the bus, right? The other part of it is very, very sad. It's that when they arrive in Israel, they're told that their Arabness is bad, that they speak with an accent that's ugly, that their skin color isn't right, that their facial features are wrong. And that creates self-hate and shame, and they want to cleanse themselves of their Arabness. I mean, the education system was literally designed to cleanse Mizrahim of their Arabness. They're not just reading into things, like they're literally being told these messages. And it's also kind of dangerous to be perceived as Palestinian, right? If you're carrying a big bag and you look Palestinian, that could get you in trouble with police, right? And that's happened. It's not just a theoretical, hypothetical situation. Mizrahim have been shot by police for being confused for Arab. And so what do you do? What do you do when you're in that situation where you're ashamed of this heritage? It's also very bad for you to be confused for being Palestinian. What do? You put a kippah on your head. You emphasize your Jewish identity. You wear a Magen David around your neck. And you support anti-Arab politics. You go after the more hawkish voices. You become more nationalistic. You join Menachem Begin, who has no problem emphasizing Jewish pride. Like the Labor were very secular. They didn't go around wearing a kippah. Menachem Begin did that very strategically. And he said, you have nothing to be ashamed of. You are proud Jews, and that's what you should, that's how you should be in public. You should be with me here in government. And they make an alliance. They make an alliance between the Likud, who have their own grievances with the Labor Party, and the Mizrahim, who have their grievances, and that is an alliance that kind of is held to this day. I think now we're seeing a different paradigm shift that is going to be very hard to predict, but we can think that kind of gets us to the present, but there might be more to unpack there.
I want to ask first about what happened to the Black Panthers post-1971, perhaps also post-1973, the Yom Kippur War, which is another important moment in Israeli history. And maybe you can tell us a little bit more what happened to some of the leaders that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, the movement continues in all kinds of ways until 1973, where they're about to run for office. There's signs that they're going to perhaps win some seats in parliament because they win an earlier thing for the representation on the Labor Federation board. And but then the 1973 war happens, and it is a massive shock. Israel is almost defeated by its enemies, and no one wants to talk about domestic issues anymore. Everyone is in existential dread, and there's an emphasis on unity and not criticizing. And the Panthers kind of lose out in that moment. They go on to continue organizing and agitating and meeting and doing things, but they never able to capture the masses in the same way. Although two Panthers end up in parliament after the 1977 election, the one that brought Likud to power. But they're on the left. One is with the Communist Party and one is with another leftist party called Shelley. And the Panthers keep holding that space for Mizrahi left-wing voice. They use the platforms they have and the authenticity they've gained in order to point attention to issues. They lead to kind of reforms of how people are treated in jail. And there's a lot of things that get involved with it. They get involved in the battle against drug addiction. And individual Panthers, some of them end up in a very anti-Zionist place, like Reuven Abergel. Some of them become right-wing. Kohavi Shemesh becomes a lawyer and gets involved in civil rights issues. They all are kind of maintain lifelong involvements in Israeli discourse. Reuven Abergel, his story is very sad because he and his brothers get into a fight with some other Panthers like Saadia, and they end up being accused of being a mafia family, falsely accused. That we can talk about that, but that's really more. But he ends up addicted to heroin, ends up even homeless at one point, and his life is fallen apart. And then he ends up getting out of it with a little help from an old friend, and they spent by the 1990s, Reuven kind of like a phoenix comes back, and he helps create some of the first drug rehabilitation programs in the country. He fights for a lot of Mizrahi causes and fights alongside the single mothers who are protesting for better benefits in Israel. He gets involved with Ethiopian struggles, with LGBTQ struggles, public housing, anything you can imagine. He's there, and he becomes an elder to a whole generation of young people who are getting into activism, and even to artists and musicians who want to make music inspired by their ancestors and need the help of Reuven to connect to that heritage, whether through language or just through storytelling. So he becomes a very important figure in the Israeli scene.
Asaf, one last question. Is there anything that I didn't ask about the Black Panthers or Mizrahim in Israel, but that you want to add to our
I don't know if it's something you could have asked, but something I'd like to add is that the Panthers came out of nowhere. No education, street thugs, criminal backgrounds. No one expected anything of them. And then they showed up out of nowhere, shocked everyone, and changed the country and brought about a lot of positive change, a lot of unintended change as well, but a lot of positive things. So I think it's important for us in our day to still have faith in the unexpected. Be prepared for another group of young people from an unexpected place, whether in our Israel-Palestine context or any context. Like the next generation, the next group is coming, and they always do. So let's not be too jaded as we age and listen to the youth.
This was Asaf Elia-Shalev, author of Israel's Black Panthers, The Radicals Who Punctured a Nation's Founding Myth, published by University of California Press in 2024. Asaf, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.